to show us some ingenious ways to do genealogy in Egypt. So over to David.
Great, thank you, Tom. I should start by saying that I'm not an Egyptian Jew, although there is an Egyptian Mendoza family. My interest in the subject started with my late mother, who had a number of Egyptian Jewish friends, especially they played bridge together in French. And I was always impressed that there was something different about Egyptian Jews. They were always so well turned out and sophisticated and just multilingual, the way they could just switch from one language to another at the drop of a hat. And then, as some of you know, sorry about that.
I'm sorry, David, that was me, because you handed me the hosting. The recording stopped.
Oh, no worries, no worries.
From now on, we are recording.
So I also work as a genealogist, and at the moment, of course, a number of people are trying to apply for Portuguese and formerly Spanish nationality on the basis of Sephardic ancestry. And Egypt is a particularly interesting country, because despite what we think about the community in Egypt, it was actually a very young community. It really came into existence in the mid-19th century. And so it's a community where virtually everybody came from somewhere else. So it's quite difficult sometimes to work out who was who. And this has led me sort of somewhat down the rabbit hole of Egyptian Jewish genealogy. And this meeting is intended as an introduction, and hopefully in the weeks and months going forward, we will have experts. We're hoping to have Yves Fedida and hopefully some other people to join us. So as Tom was saying, how do you do genealogy when the archives are I will use the word confiscated, perhaps closed is more diplomatic, and we'll get to that later. But what I'm proposing is that we divide this meeting into two sections. First of all, we will have a brief discussion of the history of the Jews of Egypt, and then we'll look at sources, and then hopefully at the end we can have a conversation. If people have ideas and suggestions, then so much the better. So obviously the Jews went down to Egypt with Joseph and left with Moses. The Greeks, first of all under Alexandra, later the Ptolemies, ruled Egypt for several hundred years. And this was a friendly environment for the Jews, and a large community evolved there. It was less good when the Romans took over. There were a number of revolts against the Romans, both in Judea and North Africa, obviously ending in the destruction of the temple. And the Egyptian Jewish community also at that time, it reduced in numbers, and this is not my period. I can't say if just people assimilated or left or were enslaved or what, but there remained, of course, a Jewish population there. The Muslims conquered Egypt, which was a Christian country, then part of the Byzantine Roman Empire, in the year 641. And obviously Maimonides, the Rambam, lived in Egypt for a while, and there were a number of Islamic and Muslim, Arab and Mamluk dynasties, which came to an end with the Ottoman Turks taking over in 1517, and nominally Egypt remained a Turkish province for most of the next 400 years, although in practice it generally wasn't. So the French Revolutionary Army invaded Egypt in 1798. They were going to use Egypt as a stepping stone to India, I think with the idea of knocking the British out of the French Revolutionary Wars. The French general was one Napoleon Bonaparte, and whilst he succeeded in conquering Egypt, The British fleet under Lord Nelson destroyed the French fleet, therefore bottling the French army into Egypt. Napoleon himself escaped home, but there was some chaos as the French were defeated and replaced, and the Turks, the Sultan, brought in his best man, who was this guy. His name was Muhammad Ali. He was an Albanian Muslim born in what is now Macedonia. And he's really one of the most dynamic figures, I think, in modern world history. It's surprising that he's not better known. I would compare him perhaps to Napoleon in terms of the sheer energy. And we'll see that virtually everything constructive and modern in Egypt can be traced back to him. And actually, at one he was brought in by the Turks, but basically then just took over nominally under the Turks, but in business for himself. And at one point, he tried to overthrow the Ottoman Empire and conquered what is now Israel and Lebanon and Syria, but the great powers told him to stop. He encouraged foreign immigration into Egypt, including Jews, I think with the idea that new people bring new ideas and new energy and can help open up the country. And he left, he assumed power in 1805 and died in 1848 and left Egypt in a considerably better position than he found it. And this is at a time when generally there was decline in the East Mediterranean. And his successors were fortunate that the American Civil War meant that the northern states blockaded the cotton-producing southern states. Britain was a huge consumer of cotton and needed to find new supplies, and they found it in Egypt, and this caused a boom in the Egyptian economy. And a few years after that, in 1869, Ferdinand de Lesseps' great project of the Suez Canal was finally finished and the canal was opened. And what this meant is that if you were trading, say, between Asia and Europe, formerly you had to go all the way around Africa, and now you could just take the shortcut through the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean, and you would save yourself perhaps a couple of weeks. And also the cost of the freight you were carrying was significantly reduced, and this had a lot of impacts. And please excuse the poor quality of my map, but if you look at the bottom right, you'll see an arrow pointing towards India, and above that there's a shaky line, which is one of the traditional trade routes, which goes up the Persian Gulf to Basra, then on to Baghdad, and you can see at the top Halab, that's Aleppo, and below it Damascus, and to the coast. And this was one of the traditional overland routes. Of course, there were others through Iran and elsewhere. And the opening of the Suez Canal, and you can see the Suez Canal, it's the blue line on the left, was hugely damaging to and disruptive to the traditional trade routes. And of course, there were a lot of Jewish merchants on those routes. And so at this time, we see emigration, and we see emigration to the Americas, to Western Europe, obviously, specifically to Britain and to France. And we also see emigration from what's now Syria and Iraq to Egypt, which, as we say, was a booming economy. Elsewhere, the Ottoman Empire was in economic and political decline. Subject peoples such as the Greeks and the Serbs and the Bulgarians were fired up with nationalism. And this was a sort of religious, sort of ethno-linguistic nationalism, which left really no place for minorities or for other groups, so that the Jews, who could function perfectly well within a multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire suddenly found themselves squeezed, let's say, and as well as these wars, there was also the economic decline. And so again, we see migration from that region again to Western Europe, to the Americas, and also to Egypt, because we have to remember that Egypt was perhaps, I'm not sure how to compare it now, perhaps to sort of some booming economy, maybe a sort of a Singapore or South Korea. At the other end of the Mediterranean, in Morocco, the Spanish-Moroccan War was going on, and we have the same sort of situation, and many Moroccan Jews decided that they would leave, and some went to Egypt. This image is of the port of Livorno in Italy in the late 19th century. And of course, we know it as this booming port in the 18th century, sort of one of the great centers of the Western Sephardim. But by this stage, it had declined, and we can see somewhere that's really quite sleepy. And again, Jews emigrated. I mean, very famously, we have families like Montefiore and Disraeli moving from Italy to England. But again, one of the places of emigration was Egypt, and as in these places, so in a number of others, and this is the port of Alexandria, and we can compare it to Livorno, and we see it's full of ships and energy and bustling, and a completely different situation. So most of the Jews that settled in Egypt, perhaps the settlement started at the invitation of Muhammad Ali, but the sort of 1860s seem to have been the boom time. They settled in the great port of Alexandria, in the administrative capital of Cairo, and to a lesser degree in Port Said, especially Adeni Jews, Jews coming up from what's now Yemen, favored Port Said. So the Egyptian economy was not being particularly well managed by the leadership, and the British were both owed money, and by this point the Suez Canal had become the absolute essential artery of the empire. And in 1882 they sort of moved in and didn't exactly conquer Egypt, but there was this uncomfortable situation that existed really for about the next 70 years. And a lot of the story of the next 75 years or so is of the Egyptian leadership, so clawing back power from the British. We have discussed the Jewish migration from a number of different places, but it seems to me that what happened in Egypt, which was quite special, is these different migrants sort of formed together very quickly into a coherent Egyptian Jewish community, despite their various origins. In Cairo, of course, there were separate rabbinates for Sephardim and Ashkenazim and Karaites, but it's my impression, and I should say I'm not an Egyptian Jew, but my impression is that people were beginning to self-identify as Egyptian Jews rather than where they came from. I think it's also worth adding that a lot of the first generation were not particularly well educated, but it seems that very quickly they rose up the social and economic ladder. So many of the immigrants, when they came, they maintained their nationality. So if you came from Italy or an Italian possession, say Rhodes, you might be an Italian. If you came from French North Africa, you might be French. And of course, a lot of people in Anatolia had nationality from France and other countries. And Muhammad Ali had tried to make Egypt as friendly and as welcoming as possible. So that if you were a French person in dispute with another French person, you would take your dispute to the French consul, and you would have it settled in the consular court. However, if you were disputing with, say, an Italian or indeed an Egyptian, you would go to the mixed courts, the mixed tribunals, and have your case heard there, rather than the native Egyptian court, which might be assumed to favor local people. And the mixed tribunals, the language they used was French, and the legal system was largely based on French jurisprudence. The system, as we discussed, was gradually being eroded. The so-called capitulations that gave foreigners in the Ottoman Empire a degree of autonomy ended in Turkey when I think in 1926, Mustafa Kemal, during the Turkish Revolution, ended that. And in Egypt in 1937, the final years of the Egyptian Jewish community, I think, are best dealt with by somebody who was there or who knows much more. So I will just skate over the surface. But what we see, so from that time going up to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, is we see loss of privilege. We see people being forced to choose nationality between having an Egyptian passport or a foreign passport. We find some people discover that they're stateless. There is discrimination in employment, so that I think 75% of jobs were reserved for Egyptian citizens, or indeed for Arabs. And we see a rise in anti-Semitic violence. And this is not just connected with the emergence of the State of Israel. So that in the early 1940s, when it looked like the Germans might take Egypt, there was anti-Semitic attacks then. And going forward, there were people were being arrested and bullied, and having properties expropriated and expelled, and so forth. And the Jewish population went from around 60,000 in 1940 to a handful today. So these are the last two significant Egyptian monarchs. Fuad on the left, as he actually set up the Royal Archives, the National Archives having been set up by Muhammad Ali, and Farouk on the right. This is when he was young. He grew quite corpulent when he got older. I would describe him as a not entirely competent leader, although he was friendly towards the Jews. But he got overthrown in the 1952 coup d'état, and this ultimately brought Nasser to power, and Pan-Arabism, which is, of course, a complete reversal of what Muhammad Ali was trying to achieve. And if you have Pan-Arabism, you don't really have space for other people. And I'm afraid that's the sad situation that we got to. And the Egyptian Jewish diaspora is spread around. There's a significant community in Israel, also in Brazil, in France, in America, in Argentina, and of course here in Britain and elsewhere. So sources for Egyptian Jewish genealogy. The goal, at least in my personal research, is trying to sort of bridge this period between about 1850 and 1930, because people who left will normally know who their ancestry back to about 1930. And what I'm normally trying to do is to work out who these families were and where they came from, in the hope that on the other side of Egypt, we can sort of pick them up and say, certainly if they're from, say, Livorno or Tunis, we might be able to take them back hundreds of years. And the obvious place to start is the Jewish Community Archives. But as Ton has said, many of these are closed to us. Again, somebody better qualified can probably share the details, but over recent years, the archives were placed in a synagogue in Cairo, and I think quite carefully watched. I believe that the Nebi Daniel Association of Egyptian Jews and others tried to both get access and to pay for the digitization with no success. And more recently, they have been moved to the Egyptian National Archives. And it's very difficult, not just for Jewish research, but for any research, but I think particularly for Jewish research to get access there. On the right is an image from an Italian TV program, which just shows one of the documents there. I don't know what is in the archives, but I suspect it's a complete treasure trove. On the plus side, some of the Cairo records have found their way to the special collections of the Yeshiva University in New York, and these include records of the Ashkenazi community between 1933 and 1955, and hopefully these will be digitized. The Egyptians want them back, but hopefully that won't happen. Often when we don't have vital records of birth, marriage, death certificates, we can go to the cemeteries and just read the tombstones. The main Jewish cemetery in Cairo is the Basatine, which is unfortunately in a very sad state of repair. Part of it was knocked down to make a ring road. Early last year, an American and Egyptian charity supported by the American embassy said that they were going to start looking after the place and doing some renovations. I believe that about 5% of the gravestones have been indexed. These are just some images that I culled off the internet. The situation in Alexandria is somewhat better insofar as the three cemeteries there have large walls around them, and so whilst rubbish might be thrown over, the actual graves are better looked after. I should have actually said that in Cairo, some of the wealthier families also had private cemeteries, and those tend to be better looked after because even when the families left, they were still able to pay for the caretakers. In Alexandria, I don't know if anybody has indexed the three Chutney cemeteries. And this is the Jewish cemetery in Port Said, which is apparently completely overgrown, which may actually be a protection. But again, I don't know if that has been indexed in any way. So Egyptian records, as we've said, that a lot of Jews in Egypt were not Egyptian citizens, and so will not have Egyptian birth, marriage, or death certificates. My understanding is that civil birth and death certificates were issued from 1912, so that if your ancestors were Egyptian citizens, you might be able to get hold of them, probably needing the help of some lawyers in Egypt. And I've heard from people who have succeeded in getting certificates and those who haven't. I am not entirely clear about marriage. There is no civil marriage in Egypt, but I'm not quite sure at what point the civil authorities started to register marriages. We come back again to Muhammad Ali. One of the things that he did just before he died in 1848 is he instituted a census. And this was an extremely detailed census. So it was asking, who people were at an address, what their ages were, what they did for a living, what their religion was, what their nationality was. and the detailed documents apparently survive, and also for the 1868 census. And these are being studied by Professor Mohamed Saleh at the University of Toulouse. And the hope is obviously that he will be able to digitize and index. And this would completely revolutionize our understanding of the period, because 1848 is probably just before mass foreign immigration, and 1868 is well into it. So we would learn a huge amount from that. And we should also mention, of course, Moses Montefiore, who created a census of the Jewish population of Alexandria in 1840, and that can be seen at the Montefiore Endowment website. He and his wife also had census of other Jewish communities in the region. And again, that can be helpful if you're trying to work out who your, or rather where your Egyptian Jewish ancestors may have come from. And of course, the Egyptian census continued. The last one under independent rule was in 1882, published in 1884. Unfortunately, from what I hear, only the headline data survives. So the individual information that names families and so forth is lost. But I apologize for the small size of this. This is something I transcribed from the 1897 census in the British Library. The dark blue down the side is the nationalities of the people, and the rows across the top are where they live. And basically what we see is there are about 12,500 Jews who are Egyptian citizens, and about 12,500 who have other nationalities, of which Italian is about 4,500, French about 3,500, Austro-Hungarian about 1,500, and Greek about 1,000. I'm assuming the Austro-Hungarians were mostly Sephardic, but of course there were a lot of Ashkenazim there as well. And we have a few oddities, like two people from Sweden, and people coming from further afield. So we see 233 from Persia. And as I say, we have headline data from other census, but not the details. So we see that the total size of the community by 1907 had increased, and we can see that most people are in Cairo and Alexandria. We discussed before the mixed courts, and they produced a journal 3 times a week, and also another publication. In all honesty, I haven't seen these. I suspect that they are quite dense, but in the fullness of time, when everything is digitized, we should be able to search names and find quite a lot about Jews. And again, these will have been bought by major libraries abroad, by national libraries, legal libraries, diplomatic libraries. And so presumably full sets of these exist outside Egypt, outside the power of the Egyptian government. We should mention this other archive, which is apparently even more difficult to get access to, and this contains tax records and also land registry records. This is in Cairo, and we shall talk a little bit more about the land registry in a bit. So we've said that half the Jewish population had foreign nationality, and so if you want to get birth, marriage, or death certificates for them, they would have been recorded in the consuls and the consular archives, which in most cases will be in the national archives of the country. I think the Italians are still in the consul in Alexandria, but I may be mistaken. And there are also consular court records, so that if you're an Italian having a fight with another Italian, the consular court will have those records. I suspect this will be quite useful for genealogy because very often fights will be over wills, and so everyone will be of the same nationality. Naturalization records obviously are slightly different because these are in the actual country itself rather than in their consulates. But when people go to another country and adopt nationality, that creates paperwork, and naturalization records will tell us the person's name, their date of birth, their place of birth, their spouse, their children, normally their parents, and perhaps other information. And perhaps once we can sort of get that, we can just push back yet another generation. And again, the national census probably needs no introduction. The census in the other countries will generally say, you know, where somebody was born, how old they are, and what they did. Diplomatic correspondence, I think, is interesting, especially towards the end period when individuals are taking their petitions to the consulates, who are then writing back to their home governments asking for instruction or just sharing information. And this is a photo of the Italian consulate in Alexandria, and you can see it's a very big, imposing, and beautiful building. And that was obviously a community that expected to stay there. And this is just a document from the British consular court that I found online. So Jewish sources. Jeff Malka's Sephardic Gen is as on most Sephardic subjects, excellent. And I think not just for its data on Egypt, but again, if we're trying to work out where somebody comes from, Jeff has a general index, and you can throw the surname in. And obviously, you don't know which of the countries the person might be related to, but it certainly gives you a clue on where to look next. The Yad Vashem database, I mean, you know, thank God there was no Holocaust in Egypt, but this is an immigrant population with relatives elsewhere. And again, if you're trying to work out where a family comes from, Yad Vashem can be helpful. And remember that the information about who had died was supplied by relatives, and perhaps that can open doors if by contacting the families of those people. I'm a huge fan of onomasticons, of these sort of surname directories, of which Alexander Beider has made some excellent studies of Ashkenazi communities, and now of Megarashim, of Western Sephardim and Italians, and hopefully we will soon see on the Eastern Sephardim of the Ottoman Empire, and generally speaking of the Arabic-speaking and Berber-speaking populations. My own website, SephardicGenealogy.com, has a lot of links. The Encyclopedia of Jews in the Islamic World can be helpful. There is a full print copy for those in the UK on the open shelves in the British Library on the 3rd floor in the African and Asian reading room. So the Alliance Israélite Universelle ran schools throughout the Jewish world. Jean-Claude Coupermintz spoke to Sephardic World about this a few weeks ago, and we have a recording of that meeting on the Sephardic Genealogy page on YouTube. Unfortunately, they rarely have pupil lists, but the Alliance has lists of people who worked for them and perhaps people who supported their work. And it's worth remembering that there are other organizations running schools, principally French and British. And again, all of these records should be outside of Egypt, so outside of the control of the Egyptian government. And another source I'm just beginning to look at is Freemasonry. There are a number of different traditions within Freemasonry. There's the English, Scottish, I think 2 French, the Italian, and sometimes local traditions start. And these records are likewise outside of Egypt. The Ancestry.com has started to index some of the British, the English tradition. And I was in touch with the archivist of the Scottish Masonic Archives, who said that he can see lots of names there that he believes to be Jewish, but is not sure. And these Masonic archives should tell us, obviously, sort of names and dates and places and addresses. But hopefully they can tell us something more, because very often members of the same family, or at least friends, will belong to the same lodge, that people in the same lodge will do business together and so forth. And a lot of Jews were Freemasons because it gave them an opportunity to mix with others from society on equal terms. And obviously there's other sorts of fraternal societies too, such as the B'nai B'rith. This is actually one of the documents from Yeshiva University on the Cairo branch. There are a number of associations of Egyptian Jews and people interested in Egyptian Jewish history and the whole experience of that. We mentioned Nebi Daniel already, but of course there are several others, and they hopefully have their own resources that we can call upon. So media, obviously there were Egyptian Jewish newspapers, there were general Egyptian newspapers in which Jews can be mentioned, same with foreign media and the international Jewish media, and business directories too. So this newspaper, Lahore, is an Egyptian newspaper. It's not the famous French newspaper. And the Israel National Library has been scanning lots of Jewish newspapers from all over the world, and you can therefore search these newspapers by name, and that can often be a rewarding thing to do. And trade directories, again, they can sort of tell us sort of who was active, doing what, and when, and where, and what business they were in. Le Mondien Égyptien also has pictures of the great and the good, so that perhaps, for example, members of the Suarez family who were quite well off will have pictures of themselves there. So the cadastral surveys, I think this is perhaps, I don't know, I speculate, this is at the heart of the matter of why Jewish documents are effectively under lock and key, that a lot of property was expropriated, and if you can't prove who you are, then you can't sue the Egyptian government in the American courts, which is where it mostly happens. There are cadastral maps, indeed there are full sets of cadastral maps outside Egypt. This is a photograph that I took of a map here in London, and even if your interest isn't in property restitution, it can be interesting to see very precisely where your family lived, and in time, please God, you can go back to Egypt and see where the family were. So during the Egyptian Revolution in 2013, when Hosni Mubarak was overthrown, the Egyptian border guards stopped some trucks carrying several tons of documents that were going to cross into Jordan. And it turns out that these were the Cairo land registry records that were from that fortress that we saw earlier. And they were presumably not going to Jordan. One suspects that they might have been going to another country in the region with the goal of being used to recover stolen property. And actually, the Israeli government, I think, has shown some interest in restitution for Jews. And this is the famous Hotel Cecil in Alexandria. It's where Winston Churchill used to stay when he went to Egypt. And this actually was returned to its Jewish owners by the Egyptian courts. However, the family that owned the Coca-Cola bottling plant in Heliopolis, which is on the edge of Cairo, have literally been fighting for a generation against the Coca-Cola company to get restitution, and sadly without any success. DNA, I mean, I'm not a DNA expert, but fairly obviously we have a community that hadn't been living, for the most part, hadn't been living in Egypt for more than a few generations. So that if somebody takes a DNA test, an autosomal, so-called family finder test, then hopefully they will find matches with people from elsewhere. I don't know, maybe from Iraq or from Greece or from wherever, and through that be able to piece together the missing part of the story. And of course, people can also take a Y-DNA test, and the Avateno DNA project now has a growing library of Jewish male DNA that it can be compared against. And again, of course, mitochondrial DNA, which we all inherit from our mothers, although that's less useful because it mutates at a much slower rate. And unfortunately, genealogy tends to trace men much better than women. So personal records probably is where we should have started, but let's finish there. And I would encourage everyone to interview older relatives, ideally on film, but if not, at least record them and do it several times and just let them speak. Here in Britain, we actually have a couple of organizations that are doing precisely that, and I think it's excellent. I think it's also worth to ask around the wider family, because a lot of people, they left Egypt under pressure at very short notice, and some people thought very carefully about what to take, and some just grabbed what they could. But we sometimes find that there's family members who have ketubot or photographs or even letters, and letters are quite valuable because what language is the letter written? Is it written in English or Italian or French or Ladino or Arabic? If it's written in Arabic, well, where is that? What sort of Arabic? Is it Moroccan Arabic? Is it Syrian? Is it Iraqi? And sort of often from very little things we can open doors. A number of Egyptian Jews have published memoirs. I mean, obviously these are about their own experiences and their families, but they talk about other families and business connections and so forth, and this can be quite useful. I actually found somebody I was looking for in somebody else's memoir, and finally these sort of ephemera. These are just bits of paper, and I'm seeing there's a lot are appearing on the internet, largely on Pinterest and eBay, which makes me suspect that somebody probably got some filing cabinets from perhaps from the rabbinates in Cairo and Alexandria, and just here's a few examples. So here's a birth record from the Karaite community of Cairo. This is a school report from Cairo for Jacques Maurice Yacoub. This is an envelope from the company of Jacques Sasson. This one, the Brit Milah document for Felix Arbib, and I was actually been able to find some of his relatives. Sadly, he's no longer with us, so I was able to share this with them. This one, I'm afraid I'm not sure. My Arabic is just about up to reading a menu, but this lady is somehow connected to the Jewish hospital of Alexandria. I don't know if she worked there or she was a patient or what, but there are hundreds, probably thousands of these documents now floating around the internet, and I it would be nice if from somewhere we could get the resources to actually just make copies of everything and index before they just sort of dissipate off to goodness knows where. So I'm afraid that was a very quick canter through the environment, and I think this is a community we should return to, because it's such an interesting community, and I think such an important community in terms of Jewish history and just what they achieved. I really don't pretend to be an expert on this subject, but if anyone has anything to share or some questions that perhaps can be answered by myself or somebody else, then feel free. So, Ton, over to you.
Thank you, David. That was excellent. You mentioned a lot of sources that I wouldn't even have thought of. So far, I see no questions in chat. Kevin Martin posted a few links to sources
Excellent.
In chat. And on YouTube, there are no questions yet. So, over to our public.
Stunned everyone into silence. I would say that the some of these sources and some of these approaches would work equally well in places like Syria and Iraq, where and perhaps Aden as well, where we don't have very much to work with, but you know, there's always something to find.
Can you stop screen sharing?
I can.
Yeah. Questions, anyone?
Somebody, KM has their hand up.
Yes. Hi, David. It's Chris.
Hi. Oh, hi. Nice to speak to you.
Okay, now you can. Hi. Yes. I'm sure you're aware there are loads of people within the London S&P who stem from Egypt, and I'm sure they've got very interesting stories. Smuhars from Smuhar City and so on, and lots from Cairo. And if you want any names or links, if you're not sure, I can provide you with lots of names. Happy to do that.
No, thank you. I have one of the things from my mother is a cookbook it was given to my parents by Patricia Smuhar, and it has this wonderful line in "We tell our butler too," which seems a wonderful way to.
Well, the Smuhars do still exist. There are plenty of them.
Yeah,
not necessarily named Smuhar anymore, but there are plenty of them at Lauderdale, and there are also quite a number who came from Cairo, including one family who went there to took their children back not that many years ago, to show them where they'd lived and where they'd come from. And it was at the time, I suppose, just before the last uprising, and they got stuck there, and luckily managed to get out to Israel and home. So that wasn't such a good experience, but there are lots, I'm sure, that have got plenty of stories. I'm obviously, as you know, Portuguese origin, nothing to do with Egypt, but if you want any names, I'm happy to supply.
No, I mean, I know the Mizrahis as well, and my mother had lots of Egyptian friends. I think this is what really turned me on, that there is a sort of elegance and a sophistication, and just you're sitting in a restaurant and they will be speaking in French to somebody on one side and English to somebody on the other side, speak to the Italian and waiter, and then to the waiter in Italian, and then sort of comment on some rude thing that's being said in Arabic by somebody at the next table. And it's
Yes.
just such a wonderful, wonderful community. Yeah. But Bernard, Tom, can you demute? Oh, Bernard is demuted. Okay.
Hi. Yeah, this is. I start with an apology, and it's no reflection on you, but I'm not very well, and I fell asleep. So if you've talked about this, and I withdraw the suggestion and apologize. But one of the things that I keep coming across as I search for family is the number of people who went through different universities. And I wondered whether or not you've looked at university records, because I'm guessing that they could prove to be at least a partial lead into families and their histories, particularly in those areas that we know that Jews were involved in, which would be things like medicine and law. So it's just a suggestion, because again, I'm not claiming any Egyptian roots, although I have found some Egyptian DNA.
No, it's a good suggestion, and actually I forgot to put in a slide on professional organizations, because as you say, there was sort of no shortage of Jewish lawyers and doctors, and yeah, I think that's a very good idea.
Francis has a question.
I was just going to say that because I grew up with a shouty Sephardi family, very large numbers, from Egypt, who had been kicked out of Spain, and there is a line of descent which has got me my passport.
Yeah,
it feels very strange to be in that context, living in the present now. But what fascinates me about my own family is the way they travelled. When you look at the history of Sephardi Jews, you look at the history of Ashkenazi Jews, the Ashkenazim sort of ended up, not all of them in shtetls, but the Sephardi Jews rushed about like maniacs all over the world. And indeed, my family did that. They went to the south of France, they went across further east, they rushed off to America. They never really sat still for very long. And it was a very, even although it was normal for me, it was also completely exotic, because when I went to school, there was nothing quite like it. Manchester High School for Girls, very stodgy, and there was this maniacal background. But it is very interesting because of that sense of being English and I didn't think I was foreign at all, actually. I thought I was really quite English with all the yelling and shouting. So it was a fascinating combination of a sense of identity, which has served me well all my life, I think.
I think that's an interesting point, because it does seem that one of the, and obviously it's a generalization, but one of the sort of differences between the, certainly my family, between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic sides of the family, is that the Ashkenazim seem to have had one great migration, and that's it, from the old country to the new. Yeah. Whereas as you're saying, we're sort of hopping around all over the place, I suppose, until fairly recent times when the two communities just merged. But
also the if you saw David Olusoga's program on, was it Samarkand, and the history of the Jewish slave ship owners.
It was
Suriname, taking the slaves to Suriname, and then the slaves would be liberated and everybody would marry each other in Suriname. Jews as well as non-Jews would marry the odd slave. And this sort of extraordinarily exotic combination of things, and the conversion and unconversion all over the world. With that, I don't know whether people felt a sense of conscience about it. I have no idea. Are there any records of that? Did they worry about it? I suppose some of them must have.
We've had several sort of meetings touching on slavery, and we'll presumably have more. I think it's I don't know. I mean, there was a member of my own family who was transporting slaves within Brazil, and later got burnt alive as a Jew, and you wonder what was going on in people's minds at that point. There was another, I mean, this is off our topic here. There was another relative, well, assumed relative, who was fleeing Spain with his wife and his slave, and got arrested by the Inquisition in Pamplona when they was trying to get to the French border. And you just wonder what this slave girl was thinking. Was all these things going on around her, and it was completely bizarre. But that is Sephardic history. It's very, very strange.
Yeah.
Kevin Martin has his hand up. He has unmuted himself. Kevin? We can't see him, so I don't know what's going on.
Not me, Tom.
Yeah.
Okay.
KM.
Tom, it wasn't me. There's someone
Okay.
up there called KM.
I assumed it might have been you. KM.
No, I've already spoken.
We have a few questions on YouTube now. Was there immigration to Egypt from Bulgaria?
I haven't seen Bulgaria in a list of countries, but then at the bottom there is this others category, and I strongly suspect that there will be Bulgarian Jews within the others category.
Okay. And then there's someone who wants to know what information is required for proof to move to Spain, which is a very
just send us
an email. Send us an email.
Yeah, I think that's the best.
Yeah. And there's Anna Paula Costa Hyde who wants to draw attention to the book by Richard Zimler, The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon. Not sure what that has to do with Egypt. But maybe
I think at the end some of them head off towards the Ottoman Empire, but I think that's to Istanbul rather than to Alexandria.
Okay. So that's about it. Someone else? No. Then I think it's time to wrap up, David. Thank you, each and everyone, for supporting us, and thank you for watching us tonight. And thank you to our patrons for supporting us. And next week we will have Ali Ergansoy, who will talk about the Da Costa Gomez and the Bizarro family, I believe. And it will be very interesting. So you are all invited to come to this place next week, same time. David?
Thank you. Ton, you have control, so you must close the meeting.
Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting now, and see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you.